Delighted to welcome you tonight to the Night of Ideas, and the theme tonight is Alive, and we are going to start with a great panel exploring the ways in which citizens, artists, scientists get involved in the fight against climate change. And Sonia Stolper, who's the UK and Ireland correspondent of French newspaper Libération, is going to chair this panel, and I am going to leave her the floor. Have a great discussion.
Thank you, Alice. So we have the immense honor and responsibility to kick off with the Night of Ideas, and I hope you enjoy the discussion, because we have a fantastic panel and a fantastic theme, which is our nature, our lives. So the way it's going to go, we're going to engage in a conversation with my first two guests, Joe Smith and Yinka Shonibare, and then we'll have two more guests just after that first bit of discussion, who will join us on stage, and we'll have a long discussion. So that's Fehinti, Balogun, and Imogen Davis. I'll explain who they are, and I'm sure you've read already carefully all the program and everything. And then, of course, we will finish by a question and answer, so please think about which question you would love to ask our panel. And we'll try to stick to 1 hour, so the questions will need to be very short and precise. Anyway, so I might begin by just reading again the description of our panel. What are we going to talk about? We're going to talk about humanity's devastating impact on the Earth that has led to what experts call the sixth extinction. And while alarming reports, and we saw over the last months, Australia, fires, the Arctic melting, grassroots movements are increasing worldwide, urging and putting pressure on governments to take action. But then as well, you have that other aspect of that fight, if we can call it this way, which is how individually we live and we act in different and completely different ways to address that time of crisis or difficulties. And we're going to address Joe Smith, who is here, the director of the Royal Geographical Society, and who is a specialist into more environmental social science, I would say. And then we have Yinka Shonibare, who is a very well-known artist. I'm sure you know him. He's so well-known that actually in 2013 he became a Royal Academician. And I don't know if you've seen his installation, which is called the British Library in the Tate Modern. It is fantastic. I strongly recommend you go. It's still on until end of 2020. So maybe we're going to begin with Joe, and I think you brought to us a slide, and you're going to explain to us what it means and what you want to talk about.
Thanks very much. It's a great honor to be here tonight, particularly tonight. I think quite a few of us are considering this the French giving us a refuge. So the disunited kingdom, as I suspect we will now become known, has got many of its best ideas from the other side of the channel. So I think to celebrate a festival of ideas in the company of the French is excellent, because Britain needs ideas in a hurry. I'm going to, before we go any further, invite a round of applause for Sonia, because she has spent this week trying to make sense of this country and lead putting together a special issue of Libération for tomorrow for the main edition in France. So can we please give her a round of applause? So I'm just going to spend a few minutes introducing this theme. I'm going to tell both my own story and over 7 billion stories, or attempt to, in just a few minutes, with the help of NASA. So the image we have behind me is the NASA Earthlights image. It's a composite of the Earth from space. It's photographs of the Earth from space at night. And they stitch the images together. And I was sent it as a Christmas card by the Observer's technology correspondent about 10 years ago. And ever since, I've found it an incredibly rich, meditative tool in thinking about where humanity has got to on environmental issues. So a lot of the time, environmentalists and many environment researchers would glance at this and see it as a somewhat fearful image, because our difficult new knowledge around climate change tells us that fossil fuel use, energy use is a real hazard, that it'll bring great waste and suffering, probably within the next few years, possibly already being evidenced, and certainly within the lifetime of anyone under 20, really significant waste and suffering. So I think, as I say, many read it as a rather fearful image. But I think we need to remember, in the same breath, that this is an extraordinary index of human achievement. Illumination, the fact that people can sit safely and work and read and share ideas at night, rather as we are. And that actually this picture is changing all the time, and from my point of view, changing in good ways. You know, China is illuminated. We've seen in the space of just one generation the biggest poverty alleviation project in human history. And that's achieved, among other things, through illumination. So as we approach climate change, I think we need to hold both of those thoughts in our minds. And so when I see one of the more popular placards from the school strikes and Extinction rebellion, system change, not climate change, I immediately find myself asking myself, what is meant by system change? So just to extend that a few sentences, if that's all right, Sonia. I'm a white middle-aged man. That distinguishes me on the panel, unusually, I have to say, for London panels. And more than that, if you were looking for one person who is genetically responsible for climate change, you are looking at that person. Because I am in a long line of clockmakers from the English Midlands. So for 250 years we've been making clocks, cutting gears, telling the time. And if you didn't have a clockmaker, you couldn't have a factory, which meant that you couldn't, in the English Midlands, create what was a very particular form of industrialism, which resulted in the Industrial Revolution and resulted in what environmental historians call the Great Acceleration, the 20th century, where we just go consumption nuts in the northern world, in the global north. So you couldn't have done any of that without clockmaking. Now, not many years ago, I would have just been plain proud of that. These days, it's something to be slightly embarrassed about. But I just want to pull on a few threads which leave me optimistic. I see reasons for optimism is perhaps better, about the 20, 30 years we've got ahead of us. And some of the same kind of ingenuity that led us to connect a group of people, a building, some raw materials and some gears to produce the modern industrial system, can, I think, respond to some of the biggest challenges we've got in front of us. As I say, I think optimism is a vice, by the way, and it's a vice I suffer, but I think there are good grounds to think that we are smart enough to deal with the worst challenges we face in terms of climate risks. I say climate risks rather than emergency or crisis, and we might come back to that. Go on,
and
Sonia.
How do you reconcile that optimism with the amount of extremely terrible, catastrophic news we get and we are reading, hearing every single day? How do you reconcile that? to that
So-
idea that we are over the time where we can do something, really.
So we don't know enough to be able to know when we've overreached ourselves. But what we do know is we've had 60 years now, certainly 50 years in broadcast media and print media of telling a story about the end of the world. And I'm not suggesting that those stories were false. The waste and suffering caused by our failure to listen to the early lessons has been extreme. Huge losses of biodiversity and habitat, waste and suffering among human communities that was entirely avoidable. So I don't want to seem like a pangloss, but I do think we're overdue an outbreak of wisdom. And in that context, just glancing again at the Earthlights image, in the time since I was first sent this in 2008, LED light bulbs have become standard. This is just one shred of an example where the quality of experience that we get from slashing our CO2 emissions by 80, 90% in the case of one light bulb. And of course, you multiply that by an image like that, the 7 billion stories point. And we can achieve our most urgent needs, the need for light, illumination when the sun goes down, with a fraction of the energy and material use required. What was required for that to happen? Entrepreneurship. Actually, capitalism's quite good at delivering solutions at scale when people have a need. A policy environment which drove it. And also an appetite among people that they're just intolerant of the wasteful solution we had before. So that's just one example. But humanity's capable of amazing things, positive things in a short space of time, if we give it the right conditions and the right requirements around it.
So maybe that's the time to bring Yinka in the conversation, because it means if I understand what you're saying, Joe, is we have today the knowledge, at least a slight knowledge, maybe not all the knowledge, but we have as well that feeling of responsibility, what we've done and what we might have done better or not done. And in there, if I bring you, basically how can art, but as well some very practical views of or use of art lead to a, maybe not the solution, but a solution?
Okay. Well, I'll just speak, as an artist. I'm not a climate change specialist, but I think actually the map is very interesting because I'm going to talk about the legacy of that map and as it manifests in my work, because you can see there that most of Africa is actually in the dark there. And, we understand that. We understand the historical reason for that kind of uneven development. And we also understand, the result of colonialism and what's actually left, what's led to that, most of Africa, despite the huge resources in Africa. So can we go to the next slide? Okay, so I wanted to use this image as a way to start, because we all know that if we don't do much about climate change, the result will actually be conflict. There might be wars on water supply, cultural wars, wars about migration, and so on. So, and that's an early piece I made. Can we go to the next one? So, when I started sort of reading about global warming and the kind of precarious nature of that to humanity, I was trying to find ways to express that through my art. Now that's a globe that kind of shows the globe warming, and then the prospect. So the children are kind of precariously balanced on that, and then because you read all the statistics and figures about climate change, but as an artist you're trying to find some kind of poetic expression or a way to kind of talk about that further Okay, can we go to the next one? And that's just a further example of me kind of exploring ways to express that culturally and visually. The fabrics are, so that's batik, and they originate actually in Indonesia. And through Dutch colonialism, the Dutch industrialized the fabrics. But then when you actually talk about industrialization, you're also talking about colonial power, you're talking about the creation of textiles, and also the history of cotton as well. So the metaphor of those fabrics are actually very strong and meaningful in my work. So if we go to the next one. And then, I was thinking about just the ecosystem and butterflies and all of that. So I made those works. The works may feel quite sort of, light and playful, but actually embedded in that playfulness is the serious nature of the issues I'm trying to grasp. But okay, if we go to the next one. Okay, and the next one. Again, so there's the issue of migration as well. And we all know that, people have had to move from certain areas. Whole villages have had to move because of flooding. And again, a result of, the way we've been treating the environment. Okay, go to the next one. And so this is a piece at the Welcome Gallery at the moment. So you can actually see this piece. It's called Refugee Astronauts. And that's, an astronaut trying to find better places to go, wearing a sort of astronaut suit, and he's got all of his worldly possessions on his back. And that's kind of what we're sort of creating nomads in this kind of apocalypse that we're creating. So if we go to the next one. Because what I will go on to talk about, apart from actually making the art, as a result of making the art, I realized that I do have to do something practical. Just making the art is not, is not enough. And so if we go to the next. Okay, so before I show you this short clip, so at the moment I'm actually going to start an artist's residency space in Nigeria.
Where you lived all your child from 3 years old until 17?
Yes, so I grew up in Nigeria. I grew up in Lagos. But I didn't want to just do a residency space for artists. I also want to contribute to the ecosystem. I've been making work about climate change, but then how can I actually, through my art, actually impact the society, particularly in poor areas of Africa and Nigeria. So I bought this 54-acre land, and we've already planted 1,000 trees of cashew there. We have 5 greenhouses, doing tomatoes and peppers. There's a village near this farm, and the women have to travel 2 days to get their produce to market. And we are now producing, vegetables there and what they need. And we have planted 2 acres of plantain, 2 acres of maize, 2 acres of cassava. And the idea is also to, we've already employed 12 people on the farm. And we are going to start tree planting as well on that land. So it's a combination of food sustainability and conservation that we're going to do. And the artists, when they go to Nigeria, will be able to go to the farm as well. So we will have artist studios on the farm, and we'll have a barn house for the artists as well. But most importantly, we talked about colonialism and just, I would like the artists to, that's the main point about the cultural exchange, that people go and have the infrastructure to visit Africa, stay there for 3 months, change the way they what they know about Africa, educate themselves. I think this is really important because it's a very important way to mitigate the negative results of conflict. And so I'll just show you the short clip so that you can get a sense of what the farm looks like. Yes, that's, yeah. And I'm already building a 2-kilometer road that goes into the farm. And the village didn't have electricity because the transformer broke down. But when I acquired the land, they were able to actually acquire a transformer. Now that's a huge thing because now they have electricity and then their children can do their homework, and the knock-on effect is actually huge. But for a relatively small amount as well. But anyway, that's it, yeah.
So in a way, you like Joe. I'm lucky because I'm surrounded by relatively optimistic people, and it's quite nice to think that not everything is lost. But what is interesting is what you were talking about, Joe, the ingenuity and the fact that there are so many possibilities to improve actually the situation. That's what you're proving in a way. You wanted to add it?
Yes, there's a danger in this short presentation of my argument. I think climate change does present deep risks, and most of the negative consequences will be experienced by those least responsible and those most vulnerable. And all of our politics around climate change and the cultural work as well, I think, around it, I think it's there in yours, is a conversation between responsibility and vulnerability. But I guess one of the things I want to remind myself of in the bathroom mirror, not just you lot, is that across 25 years, we've done 2 amazing things. We've explained to a majority of people on the planet in ways that they find convincing the idea that the way you boil your kettle, how you choose to travel, has a global, a consequence for the global climate. I think it's amazing that we've achieved that in a short space of time. The media have played a positive role, although a somewhat epidemic approach. It would be good if it was more consistent. The second, from my point of view, source of optimism is that we've got an international system of both summarizing the best available knowledge through the UNFCCC and building the best possible international answer through the United Nations process. And that process is, one detail is really important about it. The France, the Paris COP of 3 years ago that amounted to a major step forward was important not because it was the answer, but because it was another step along the road. But at that step, they committed every country to a ratchet. They have to come back every few years, and this year, at the end of this year, is the next big item when we all see all of our nations make a bigger, bolder promise than they did in Paris. And that ratchet principle is really important. Within the ratchet principle, that only really works if there's real political energy behind it. Now,
yes,
if you'd asked me 3 years ago...
That's the question about empty promises or big grand gesture of, gathering many countries or head of state and government signing something, committing to some real important things, and then the follow-up. So probably, as you were saying, media is responsible for that partly to put them, ask them, what are you doing? Where are the results? And so what you say is absolutely true. We, in the media, when I began as a journalist, which is a long time ago now, maybe 25 years ago, something like that, we weren't talking about environment in our newspapers or radio or TV. And now you have the proper pages and department which is dealing only about that. And even within that, you had, at the beginning, we were talking just about the catastrophic events or what was bad and what was going on. And now we moved from that. No, we still report on catastrophic events, but we are as well putting into light the solutions or the beginning of a solution, or what could be done, or which action could be done, or which action are being done, and which is the perfect way to introduce my next two guests in the conversation, who are both very much involved in our theme or debate tonight, but in very, very tangible and very different ways. And I'm going to ask them to come on the stage and introduce them both, because I think it could add a very interesting input to our discussion. So next to me is Imogen Davis. She's the founder of a native restaurant, which is in Borough Market. If you haven't been there, you have to go extremely soon. Maybe not all of you next week, because you might have a problem to accommodate all of you, but please go. And maybe you will explain what you do particularly in your restaurant, because it's not just a restaurant. It's a restaurant which is all about sustainability. And then you have Fehinti Balogun, sorry, I've been trying to say properly his name the whole afternoon, I'm sorry. And who's an actor, but he's as well an activist for Extinction Rebellion. So he's been, I think, in the streets quite a lot this last year. And so, as I was saying, it's completely different, but I think it's actions which make a difference as well. So maybe, Imogen, can you tell us a bit more about your restaurant first?
Yes, so it's called Native, and it's in London Bridge, just the other side of Borough Market. We've always I was brought up as a family from one of 6 children. My parents were really passionate about growing as much as we possibly could. And they had an organic farm shop, but it didn't make any money. And but they always made sure that we kind of would be eating a lot of veg. I guess we were kind of flexitarian before it became a thing. We would have like one piece of meat maybe every couple of weeks because it was more expensive, so we couldn't afford to have it every day. So that's kind of, I grew up eating that way before then going to university and realising like using a microwave for the first time and blowing it up and things like that, because I had no idea how it was working. The ethos of what we do is very much about using as much of the ingredient as possible. So if you know how much effort goes into producing a biodynamic carrot or a carrot that you've grown yourself, and you know that you can eat the tops, then why would you ever throw that away? So if you can make 2 meals out of a cauliflower, with one with the leaves that you can put into a stir fry and then the other with the florets, rather than throw that away, it's a lot more, as a business owner, it's a lot more efficient way to work, but you also are not throwing anything away. And I think that's where there's a fact that there's 1 in 7 people in the world are hungry. And with the figures of just in the UK of 14 million tons a year goes to landfill of edible food, I think that they don't marry up. There's all these different facts that are floating around and all these different things that people say. And for me, that just doesn't make any sense. Like, why have we got people hungry when we're throwing things away? The rise in food banks went up 23% last year. And then, from this is food loss and food waste. So as a restaurant, we very much, we're an independent restaurant. We've never had investors. And so we can't afford to have a big biodigester that can process everyone's, any food scraps into compost. So we just use as much as we possibly can. We portion things as relatively well as we absolutely can, and basically say that everyone has to eat everything that's on their plate because there's 0 waste. So we've been really, really well received. We're now 4 years old, and it's great that we're now allowed to call the snacks at the beginning of our restaurant, at the beginning of the menu, are called wasting snacks. If we'd done that 4 years ago when we opened, and having not trained in the industry and just turned up saying I was making wasting snacks, I don't think we would be here now. But you've got people that come over from America, like Dan Barber, and do wasted and really champion that waste doesn't necessarily have to be a bad word, and it's an opportunity to use this amazing produce that we've got and take responsibility for a little bit more seasonality, being excited about an asparagus when it's in season because it tastes like it, or a strawberry that tastes like a strawberry rather than having one for the sake of it in December, and it tastes like water, and not thinking
but
about.
a bit earlier we were talking about. Sorry to interrupt.
No.
We were talking about that. The fact that is it a brand? Is it just a trend to go to fancy restaurants who are doing there, and we all go there and we'll eat and we'll come out with good conscience in a way. I'm playing the devil advocate. Or is it a way of changing the system, of triggering others to do the same? And that's where you need to come in, Fehinti, because that's what Extinction Rebellion is about. Not just, it's changing the whole system. It's not just resolving climate change, isn't it?
Yeah, I'm a bit loud. Hello. It's a slogan, system change, not climate change. And I think that comes from the idea that we live in this broken system. We live in a system that in order to get through the day, you have to do things that aren't eco-friendly. So one of the things that often we are given as people to do are the individual options to fix the planet, like recycling or not flying or not buying plastic and buying eco-foods, buying sustainable foods. The only problem is, if you apply that to everybody in society, there are masses amount of people that can't do that. As for one example, my mum's right at the front, by the way. Hi, Mum.
Hello, Mum.
My mum and I went shopping on the weekend. And obviously I've got my XR brain everywhere with me, trying to live this righteous life. And we're buying eggs. You can buy a bigger carton of eggs in a plastic, non-recyclable container than you can a cardboard one. So if we apply the idea that, okay, well, we'll just buy the more expensive eggs, and that's how we're doing our work, but then we don't have enough money to buy anything else, then how can we sustain our lives? So again, we identify that the system that we live in is broken. So in order for us to go forward as a society of people, we have to change the system with which we live in. So that's where the slogan, system change, not climate change, for me, anyway, comes from. And how we challenge that system so many different ways. So for Extinction Rebellion, it's about being on the streets. It's about making sure that it is something on the brain of everybody. And these things are becoming more and more apparent as we look at the news, as we look outside of our rooms. When you think about insects, just simply insects, like hitting your windshield whilst you're going somewhere, they're gone, they're declining. Food is becoming more expensive, so it affects the people that can't afford it the first. There is a reason, and I think it's amazing to be in the French Institute and have been in the, where were we earlier?
The French residence.
The French residence.
They had a very fancy lunch.
It was very fancy. It's amazing to be in that history and culture of protest and movement and really standing up for something because it's important. And so XR sees that. Sorry. But then
I want to bring you all in the conversation, because we were talking a bit earlier about the fact that it's very good to say, as you were saying, I'm going to be good, so I'm going to recycling, I'm going to be to cook meal sustainably, I'm going to, I don't know, do my bit every day. But it's easy to do it when you're lucky enough to be educated, because we all know approximately what the issues are. It's easy to do when you can sit down in the evening and think, oh, what am I going to buy tomorrow? Which organic food am I going to buy? What about the people who are in actually the poorest? And you were saying, Joe, very rightly, that the ones who are the most affected by climate change are the poorest people, or the poorest part of society. And how do you explain to someone who is working, has 2 or 3 jobs to make ends, and how do you tell her, well, buy some organic food and cook some sustainable thing, or switch off the lights? I mean, all those little. Who wants to comment? Joe first, maybe.
I don't think there's a conflict between the two, and actually, your work in Nigeria, your work in Borough Market, both point in the right direction from my point of view. For quite a long time, we've not reflected our full values in the price we put on things. And one only part of, but in my mind an important part of, the next 10, 15 years is going to be about making sure that we do reflect the full social and environmental costs of everything we choose to do in the price we pay, whether we're in a boardroom of a major company or whether we're at a supermarket. That does require, of course, with prices for key things going up, that you protect the most vulnerable. But if we just take a country like the UK or France or the US, actually providing really good quality housing that is cheap or doesn't require any energy to heat, 15 years out will be there. Or if you provide access and mobility to the things people need without the need for fossil fuels, the poorest are the people who benefit most from that policy change, from that investment. If you look to the Global South, I don't see another way of addressing this and seeing the scale of investment that you've brought to being generalized, encouraging resilience, food security, without a flow of resources from the most responsible to the most vulnerable. And one way or another, that'll be some form of system of payment and investment in resilience, because I think it's a profound obligation that we have. And it's that's my reading of the system change, not climate change.
Yinka, you want to?
Well, I mean, my view is that, you didn't mention it earlier, but America pulled out, right, of the climate agreement. Now, some structural changes are actually really important. And America and China, they're the biggest polluters, and they have to be involved. But some of us know that might take time, and we don't have time. So the best we can do is to do what we can do individually. There might be little steps, but I think, for example, what I'm doing in Nigeria, it'll be much easier to produce food locally, provide jobs locally. People, I have people working there, and they can get their food locally. Unfortunately, Nigeria, they import 50% of tomatoes. Why would you fly tomatoes in? It doesn't make sense.
Yeah, that's we were talking about this earlier with the fact about green beans. 70% of Kenya's green beans are air freighted to the UK.
Which doesn't mean we can't grow green beans in the UK.
Yeah, and it's just kind of we've become so used to the fact that we rely on we think that we need to have those green beans all year round, when that's not the case. That's not how it used to be. We've kind of become so used to having so much choice of everything all year round on our supermarket shelves that maybe we'll feel a little bit hard done by if we go into the shop and this recipe that we wanted to make, it's not there. But actually we can start to be a little bit more creative with it, and by using something that's a lot more, so using something that's actually in season as a substitute. The horrific thing is that China and India are the biggest two suppliers to the UK of broccoli and cauliflower. Now, they're really not the most difficult to grow. They don't need tropical conditions or anything like that. Those sorts of numbers are because we've got used to the supermarkets making these decisions to say that we can have it all year round, when it's not the way it needs to be. I think we need 1,000,000%. I'm all about everybody. You can do a tiny little bit yourself, and if everybody's chipping away at that tiny little thing that you do every single day, and other people become to feel more empowered on it. And that's why Extinction Rebellion is so great as well, because you can feel part of something. And I think community, like allotments, people sharing what they grow on their allotments and utilising it rather than wasting it. There's a lot of, even in London, there is a lot of opportunity to do that.
But again, we have a problem with time, as you were saying. It's all good to do all those little actions. So maybe, is it why Extinction and all those different movements are important? Because you need to raise loudly the emergency or the fact that we don't have much time, and it's not in 10 years' time that we need to change our habits or way of doing things?
Yeah, I don't think it is one or the other. I think it's an amalgam of all of the things. If we look at something like the civil rights movement, it was it was hundreds of years of oppression and movements and things that happened. But in the last 70 years, when we had Malcolm X and we had MLK and we had the Black Panthers, we had a whole array of movements and things happening. So we had the civil disobedience, we had people in the streets, but we also had the Black Panthers later on in that movement doing community and food outreach and petitioning for traffic lights in areas that don't have traffic lights. It's a multifaceted thing to handle. So to say one thing is more useful than the other is... Hello? Thank you. We can just do it between us. To say one thing is more interesting than the other is a fallacy. It's not a useful thing to think. We have to have people going and using their privilege in whatever company they're in and changing the conversation. What Extinction Rebellion did so well was implement the idea of tell the truth last year. We're seeing more in our news outlets and the conversations that we're having now, seeing the emergency, seeing a need to do something as opposed to, well, this is going to happen later on and, oh, we might do this, but we're still going to do that, blah, blah, blah. The conversation is being changed. And this year, I think for XR, it's about actions following conversations. And what actions can you implement for this huge change? And one of the biggest things I always talk about is the conversation around the dinner table.
Yes, but then again, sorry, but yes, you hear me? Yes. We're going to end with just one microphone. The question is, it's all good, all those different actions and individual ones, or even big ones are Extinction Rebellion. It was extraordinary to see worldwide the impact of it, and in so little time, actually. But at the end of the word, as Yinka was saying, the biggest polluter are the USA and China. And the biggest polluters are the big companies who are, airlines and petrol companies. I mean, I am going to give just a very little example. When at Christmas we wanted to spend Christmas in Hamburg, and we thought, let's do it properly. Let's go by train to Hamburg from London. Have you ever tried to go from Hamburg, London to, well, don't, because it basically takes you 3 days. For Christmas it's a bit annoying. So it's a little example, but basically if you want to travel less by plane, for example, and you want to be responsible and take a train, you don't have any more night trains. You have just a new night trains from Berlin to Brussels, who has just opened that line. But how do you convince a whole global group of countries to put together politically a policy which would be really efficient and with concrete results very quickly, basically? Because if you had many countries being together, but how do you do that? Because of course the rail companies are dealt with differently in different countries. How do you sort that problem?
We're in the middle of a process that's already 25 years old that has been seeking to achieve that through the UN system. Within that, the US is out for now. I think it is a for now, but actually the US government, I wouldn't over-worry that in the sense that you only need California to drive forward the ambitions. You only need the big American cities to really engage as they have. You only need some of the biggest businesses to feel the pressure and respond, and some of them have, to change that. And of course American research plays a huge role in our understanding of climate change. So Americans as a whole are making a huge contribution to our response to this question. Chinese are another story, but actually, again, I mean, I referenced capitalism's capacity to deliver change at scale and pace, not always the one you want, obviously, but it has that capacity. China, of course, with its very unusual combination of capitalism and state communism, state socialism, can direct change at astonishing pace. And they are fiercely aware of the risks that actually their political system faces from climate change. So I think that will drive change and wisdom there. But as I say, I mean, I'd argue strongly for putting the right prices on things, and we should see carbon taxes implemented, and we should see income or entrepreneurship taxes reduced in a balancing way. And that holds huge potential and will unlock great energy. And some of the experiments we're in the midst of, some of which you've all described, could really pick up pace at that point. And we're not far off it, but you have to design those in ways that balance this responsibility and vulnerability and make sure that you've really thought into the outcomes you're looking for.
You're really an optimist. I like that.
I'd like to add to that a little bit. Yeah, really, really practical things, taxing carbon tax, taxing companies, divestment from oil companies, abandoning greenwashing projects are like necessary and absolutely have to happen. And then also, because like as well as like the activist part, there's like an artist part of me, and a theatre maker and whatever. And culture changes demand, and acknowledging the nuances in the problem is really important, because you can't have the climate movement without mentioning climate justice. It doesn't work. If we don't, like, often we get the example of like China and America being the big polluters, but we never acknowledge the history of pollution in itself. We don't acknowledge how much we import from China, how much we import export of our waste. We don't acknowledge the fact that there's carbon leakage. So whilst our emissions go down, technically, other emissions go up, and those are our emissions. They're making our things. We don't talk about aviation and shipping, which aren't included in any of the facts that we give out. Again, our emissions. There needs to be something about taking responsibility for what you have. So the argument of China and America, oh, they're not doing anything, well, it's sort of void.
No, you're right. And I suppose we can mention Malaysia recently sent back, I can't remember how many ship full of basically waste that the UK and the rest of the Western country had sent to them basically to deal with. And they sent them back to say, well, actually, you deal with your own waste. So maybe we'll get to that point where...
And I think as well with the, I can't remember who it was that said it, but effectively, even though sometimes we can feel like everything is so huge and everything's out of our grasp and this is happening and it's kind of, going faster than we can possibly control. Somebody said about every pound, every penny that we spend is effectively a vote. So choose that very wisely. So if you can, utilise that at a farmer's market or, I don't know, even, swap food with neighbours or things like that. Like every single pound that you spend is a vote. So that we do have a lot of power because we do have to, we are guilty of spending money every single day. And if you consider that in that sense, I think you can feel like you can actually make those decisions and be kind, because that's like the ultimate thing, that it spreads and you don't need money for that either.
And also, can I say?
Yes, please.
I mean, I want to say something about structural change, because, we're all here and we're all agreeing, but, next week we'll jump on a plane and fly somewhere. Mm-hmm. And we do that because we don't have a choice. And if governments will actually enable the technology to change and the industry to change, I mean, the fossil fuel industry is huge, and there's so much money involved so a lot of people don't want that to change. But then governments have to regulate and enable that environment where we then have a choice. Because right now we don't really have a choice, That's, yeah.
Just to jump on that, jumping on, I agree. I agree that people don't have a choice. We're living in a broken system. And I think within XR, one of the things that was given to us as a thing to think about is the XR being white middle class, which, it has its aspects, but also I think it erases a lot of people of colour within the movement and not just within XR. But the thing I want to take from that is the privilege. The privilege you have to challenge a system is something that defies the system that you live in. And that's part of the protest. That's part of the, okay, I have to fly, so that person goes to fly. But this other person, like myself, I can make a decision because I'm freelance, because I'm at a certain point in whatever point in my life. I can say, well, look, I don't want to do this for this. This is my action towards this change. That's me using my privilege, an example of how I can change this thing. And I think that resounds all through XR. We see people with privilege using their privilege. We also see people without privilege being encouraged to use whatever they can, and that might just be supporting, and again, changing the conversation. It sounds small, but it's quite grandiose. Hello.
And I think you're absolutely right. So we're going right now to change the conversation, or actually to change the side of the conversation. So I'm going to go to you to ask if you have any questions. And maybe we're going to begin by the lycée. I think we have some students from the lycée who had some questions. We're going to begin by them.
How will the threat of a sixth mass extinction shape politicians' behaviors in the future?
So, who wants to answer? You? You? Who wants to be the first to answer? Maybe you, the activist. So
I feel like I've talked a lot, so maybe I should give the floor to someone else for 5 seconds.
Do you want to?
Oh my goodness. Okay, let me think. I think the politicians, I think we do have a power within us and within everything we do on a daily basis. And when we can constantly, like me and all of my family, our local MP is not the one that we wanted to be in Parliament, but he got in again, and we constantly email him, and he has to listen and he has to take notice. And I think, and also picking up the phone is one of the biggest things you can do, because asking somebody to justify their actions and have conversation about it actually can trigger you can always find common ground. And I think it's really important that we pick up the phone and have conversation and let people know that we're there, because even if that's to say, I think you're doing a great job, but do definitely kind of pick up the phone and say, I really agree with this one, but when I don't agree with it, I'm going to let you know as well, because I think that's kind of quite an important thing to do.
Any other idea? How can you...
It's very easy when you're a young person to imagine that particularly senior politicians, they behave like they've got all the answers, but I can tell you, because I've met enough of them, on this topic, they know they don't have all the answers. So there's a really interesting moment where actually the political imagination is more open around these topics than any time in my life. And I think you and me should be active in providing them with ideas about the way we want the world to be 10 or 15 years from now.
Yeah. I mentioned something earlier. We had a bit of a debate about it, and that's really to do with civil disobedience and how effective is civil disobedience, and whether that's something we should condone, tolerate. But historically, it's actually worked. And but I know you have very strong views around that issue.
Well, historically, it worked when there was no violence involved. All the civil movements which actually managed to achieve something were usually civil movement without big violence or destruction or things like that. You disagree, Joe?
No, I think we didn't finish our conversation. I think that non-violent direct action has been incredibly powerful force, particularly across the 20th century, in moving the dial, in opening out the political imagination. I think particularly the school strikes have really provoked conversation. I think both XR, but particularly the school strikes, have, I think, embarrassed, frankly, older generations. And that's opening up, as I say, the political imagination, political space, but we have to fill it with some strong ideas. And I think we've been given ideas about, let's be insistent on having the best quality of food, and that happens to be more environmentally sustainable, and so on.
You're in the French Institute, so obviously good food is really important.
Well, you were saying about how you're the local primary school and the school dinners.
Yes, no, I was, that's far away, because I met a friend from the Seychelles, which is really far away, and he told me that actually in primary school, you have had since 2000, so a while ago, 20 years already, you have compulsory environmental teaching, but they call it holistic teaching, because it means that it goes abroad all the different subjects. So it's not being taught through just geography or history or politics. It's being taught in every single subject because it's part of their lives. And he was explaining it's been for so long in the Seychelles because basically our tiny islands are on first line for climate change and disappearing some of them islands. I mean, there is a real risk, so they feel it every day, basically. They feel, they can see, and that's what sometimes we lose sight of it because we don't, yes, we have sometimes a bit floodings or a bit too much snow or a bit whatever, too much heat, but we don't have tangible, still catastrophic impact on that. Other question, I stopped talking because it's more, yes? The gentleman there, yeah?
So, as you it is the press's job to keep check on political promises so that they're not empty promises, and also to differentiate between big corporations' real ecological impact and their greenwashing communication strategies. My question is, so to what extent can we expect the press to fulfill this essential task when it is owned by the same shareholders as these corporations?
Is it a question for me? Because I'm the chair, I'm not supposed to.
I think we can have an open discussion about this.
Well, not all media are owned by those corporations, but I think we have to do all our own stuff. I mean, that's what I was talking about, that we write about those stories. We go around, we look around, and we are responsible to maybe say that, or go against all climate deniers, for example, and say, no, actually we have the facts, it's not fantasy, or we do our bits the same you do yours or yours, I think.
And I think with just the Guardian have just said that they're now not going to advertise oil and gas anymore, and that's been put up across the platform, which actually is a really tiny thing, but they're having to respond to everybody's concerns about this. And by, Twitter accounts and things like that, people actually do, you have a voice on there. And I think it's great that Twitter is out there to sometimes you can feel like everyone really agrees with you, which is brilliant. But then you end up being a little bit let down when things don't go your way. But I think we have a voice on social media and platforms like that to find out exactly what the real story is and to be able to share what we believe and have really healthy conversation about it as well. And I think the Guardian having to make that decision and not advertise the oil and gas is that everyone's going to have to follow suit.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. I'm afraid we're a bit tight in time, so we need to take maybe one or two questions together because I'm being told there are so many amazing events tonight that we need to wrap up to allow the next panel to come in. I'm sorry about that. So do we have shall we take the two of them and we try to answer those two questions? Okay.
I was going to ask whether you think that the corporate interests are actually behind what people are trying to do themselves with being vegans, etc., with their changing the consumer habits. I mean, looking at supermarkets, for example, corporations are very good at pushing environment as long as it makes them more money, charging plastic bags. But I mean, I remember going to the US in the early 90s, and they already, offered paper bags as alternatives. Here, we don't have that. Don't you think the corporations should do more? Supermarkets throwing food, for example, they should think about how
that's
to
what. And what was the other question? Okay. Sorry.
Hello. To what extent do you think that the oil industry, the petrol industry as a whole, is responsible for pollution? And is that the main industry that should be targeted? Because they're responsible for gasoline and plastic.
Okay, that we talked a bit about with Yinka earlier. So you want to ask your question as well? Just to finish? Yes, because you've been putting... Okay.
It's kind of trying to summarize the kind of base approach there. Whether the change is at that fundamental human level of attitude, like using all of the vegetables is different to potentially saying, I'm going to change my milk to almond milk, and I'm still going to have it flown away from California where there's quite extensive use of pollinators, etc.
Yes.
What practical safeguards do you think should guide the people who are making these changes, so at corporate levels as well, to ensure that any change that is trying to be made, particularly given the pace that you've all talked about, actually is at that human level and trying to address the generations of kind of abundancy mindset that we have, rather than that sort of superficial greenwashing going, we're going to basically carry on the same. And with colonialism as well.
I'm going to cut you there because we won't have time. Imogen, can you wrap it up? I mean, I think you can link the...
Really quickly. I think all we can do is try to make the best, most informed decisions that we possibly can. If you know the supplier, and if you've seen, you know, if it's from a farmer's market or whatever, if you can pick that vegetable, almond milk and things like that, it's a tricky one for me. The whole of veganuary for me is not the good. If we're going to have a season in the UK that celebrates our produce, should we maybe have it in harvest time when we've got loads of fresh produce available that we've just grown, rather than the time when we're completely barren because it's winter? But equally, if we're doing anything we can and we're thinking about it, I'm very much still learning every single day. With a restaurant, you have to respond to what's happening out there, and I certainly would never say that I'm zero waste completely. All we can do is do, you know, the best that we possibly can. And if you buy a vegetable or a fruit or whatever that you see, and just maybe think, should I throw this part away? Because if somebody sold it to you, it's probably quite likely that it's going to be edible. And then maybe just be a bit creative about that. There's loads of websites and things like that you can kind of find different recipes, and the internet really is a great place to be able to share and ask questions, and even pop into the restaurant and ask I'll happily have a chat.
So I'm sorry, because we have to finish there. But one sign is clearly we could stay 3 hours more, or the whole night of ideas, and discuss about those issues. But I want to give a huge thank you to our amazing panel, to you all for being there. And please run in all the corners of this wonderful building. You have so many other different fantastic events. Please go, have a look, listen, talk, engage. Thank you very much.